Okay, so get ready because today we're diving into a story about two women, both named Susan Smith, and both connected to, well, some pretty shocking crimes.
Yeah, and it's not just the name that's the same. Both of these cases, despite being so different, really highlight some important issues in the justice system.
You're totally right. Like, one case is a hidden tragedy, kind of buried within the system itself, and then the other, it became this huge public spectacle.
Exactly, and they both force us to think about things like power abuse, societal biases, and even mental health.
So let's start with Susan Smith, number one. Her story ends tragically in 1989.
Right, in Kentucky, found dead along a coal mining road.
Yeah. And the cause of death, strangulation.
And here's the kicker. The person who killed her was her lover, and get this, her FBI handler, Mark Putnam.
Oh, wow. Okay, so right off the bat, we have a tangled web of secrets and betrayal.
It's pretty crazy, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, Putnam wasn't just some random agent. He was actually a criminologist.
Wait, really? He studied crime.
Yeah, he had all this training in understanding the criminal mind, but then he ends up committing a pretty horrific crime himself.
The irony is just almost too much.
It really makes you wonder, does understanding crime, does it somehow blur the lines between right and wrong?
That's a really good question. But before we get too deep into Putnam's head, let's talk about Susan. Where did she come from? What was her life like?
So she was born in West Virginia in 1961.
Yeah.
But she grew up in Kentucky in a big family, not a lot of money. You know, things are tough.
Okay, so a difficult upbringing, not a lot of opportunities. That definitely sets the stage.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that context, right?
Yeah.
Poverty, lack of opportunity, it can really trap people in a cycle of hardship.
You're right. So how does the FBI even enter the picture?
Well, in 1987, Agent Mark Putnam arrives in Pikeville, Kentucky. He's tracking down a bank robber. And to do that, he needs someone on the inside.
I'm guessing that's where Susan comes in.
You got it. He recruits her as an informant, and she ends up being really important in catching the criminal.
So it's like the FBI is using the criminal world to catch criminals. That seems, well, risky.
It definitely is. It's a tactic that can be effective,
Yeah.
but it also has the potential to backfire. Big time.
And in this case, it sounds like it definitely did.
Oh, yeah. Because the relationship between Susan and Putnam, it doesn't stay professional. They become lovers.
Okay, so now it's not just about catching bad guys anymore. It's this whole other level of complicated.
Yeah, it's messy. Fast forward to 1989, and Putnam is trying to get out of the relationship. He even asks for a transfer to Florida.
Trying to put some distance between them.
Yeah, but then Susan reveals she's pregnant with his child.
Oh, wow. Okay, that changes things.
For sure. He offers to have his wife adopt the baby, but Susan refuses.
So now he's stuck. I mean, he was trying to protect himself, his career, his family, but he had other options, right?
Well, he could have come clean. Face the music. But that would have meant huge consequences. Loss of his job, his reputation, maybe even jail time.
So was it really just about this unwanted pregnancy? Or was it more about power? Control?
That's the question, isn't it? It's hard to know what was going on in his head, but it definitely highlights the issue of power dynamics, especially in places like the FBI.
Right. Like, who has the power in that relationship? And how is it used?
Yeah, and it makes you think about, are there systems in place to prevent this kind of abuse of power?
And what about Susan? Did she have any power in this situation? Or was she trapped?
Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking when we look at these cases.
And that's when things take a seriously dark turn, right? All that tension, it boils over.
Exactly. It ultimately leads to Putnam killing Susan, strangling her, and then getting rid of her body.
God.
Yeah.
It's chilling to think that someone who's supposed to be upholding the law, is capable of something so brutal.
It really shakes your faith in the system, doesn't it? Like, who do you trust when the people in power are the ones committing these horrible crimes?
Yeah, and what kind of justice can there be when that happens? I mean, he eventually confesses, pleads guilty to manslaughter, and serves 10 years. 10 years.
I think that's the part that's hard for a lot of people to swallow, right? 10 years for taking a life.
It just doesn't seem like enough, and it makes you wonder, what about Susan's family? What about their pain, their loss?
It's a good reminder that behind every crime, every headline, there are real people whose lives are shattered. Their voices often get lost in all the legal stuff, the media frenzy.
And it makes me wonder, too, what if Susan had come from a different background, had more options, more support?
It's impossible to know, but it definitely makes you think about how systemic inequalities can really make people vulnerable to exploitation and abuse.
So we've got this one Susan Smith, whose story is kind of hidden, buried within the system. And then we have our second Susan Smith. Her story is a complete 180.
Oh, yeah. This one explodes in the media,
Yeah.
becomes a national obsession.
Exactly. And it raises a whole other set of questions about crime, justice, and how we as a society react to these things.
It's like looking at two sides of the same coin. And it's fascinating, but also really disturbing to see how those two sides play out.
This Susan Smith, her story is just, it's hard to even fathom. I mean, she makes national news for murdering her two young sons.
Yeah, it's the kind of case that really grips you, you know?
Yeah.
And what makes it even more, I guess you could say more complex, is how she initially tries to pin the blame on someone else.
Oh, right, right. She claims a black man carjacked her and kidnapped her sons, which of course sets off this huge nationwide search.
And you can't ignore the racial element of that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it plays right into these dangerous stereotypes that have very real consequences.
Totally. It's like she knew exactly what buttons to push, how to manipulate those fears and prejudices.
It makes you wonder, how much of that was calculated? Was she aware of how those accusations would play out, both in the media and with law enforcement?
But of course, her story falls apart. 9 days later, she confesses. She drove her car into a lake with her sons strapped inside.
It's just horrifying. The idea that a mother could do that to her own children, it's something that's really hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. And it makes you ask, what could possibly drive someone to such a desperate, such a tragic act?
Well, I think to understand that, you have to look at her past. It's not an excuse, but it does provide some context.
Okay, so what do we know about her background?
Well, for one thing, her father committed suicide when she was young, and later on, she revealed that she had been sexually abused by her stepfather.
God, that's awful.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of trauma, it can leave these deep, lasting scars. It can impact how you see the world, how you relate to people.
I mean, it's not a direct line from trauma to murder, obviously, but
No, but it's important to understand how those experiences can shape a person, their mental and emotional state.
so in her case, could that trauma have led to like instability, maybe an inability to cope with stress?
It's definitely possible. It could have also distorted her perceptions for decision making.
And then there's the whole thing about her trying to rekindle a relationship with a man who didn't want children. He even broke up with her in a letter, said he wasn't interested in kids, period.
Yeah, that must have been a huge blow.
So is it possible she saw her sons as, I don't know, as an obstacle to getting what she wanted?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer to this whole story. Was it a twisted act of love? A desperate attempt to eliminate a problem? Or was it something even darker?
It's hard to grasp the level of despair she must have been feeling to even consider such a horrific act.
And this is where I think the conversation about mental health becomes so important. I mean, this case really sparked a national debate about the role of mental illness in crime.
Yeah, and the need for more resources, more support for people who are struggling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the shock and horror of what she did, but we also need to try to understand the why, the underlying factors that contributed to this tragedy.
Her trial, of course, becomes this huge media event. Everyone is talking about it, analyzing her motives, her mental state.
Yeah, and it raises a lot of questions about how we as a society view crime and punishment. What does justice look like in a case like this? Is life in prison enough?
Well, she's sentenced to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 30 years. And her ex-husband, David Smith, the boy's father, he's been incredibly vocal about his opposition to her parole.
Yeah, and his voice is so important here because it reminds us that the impact of these crimes, it goes way beyond the immediate victims. It ripples outward, affecting families, communities.
He actually spoke out in a recent Dateline interview. It was really powerful, really heartbreaking. He talked about how his sons, they weren't just victims in a case. They were his boys, individuals with their own personalities, their own dreams.
It's a good reminder that behind those headlines, behind those legal terms, there are real people whose lives have been irrevocably changed.
And it makes you think these two Susan Smith cases, they're almost like mirror images of each other, but in a really disturbing way. One, this hidden tragedy, the other, this public spectacle.
Yeah, it's like they're both holding up a mirror to society, forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, our biases, our systems.
And they leave us with so many questions, don't they? Like, how do we define justice? How do we address mental health? What role does the media play in shaping our understanding of these complex issues?
It's not about easy answers, you know? It's about asking those tough questions, having those difficult conversations, and maybe, hopefully, moving towards a deeper, more compassionate understanding of these issues.
You're so right. It's not just about these two women named Susan Smith. It's about all of us and how we respond to these kinds of tragedies. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, why did one Susan Smith's case become this huge national story and the other one just kind of stayed under the radar?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's so many factors at play there. I mean, you got media coverage, you got societal biases, even the nature of the crime itself.
Yeah.
All those things play a part in how a story gets told, how much attention it gets.
I guess what you're saying is like we can't just take what we see at face value, right? We have to kind of think for ourselves, be a little more critical of the information that's out there.
Right, exactly. We have to be curious, ask questions, challenge our own assumptions, and I think most importantly, be open to hearing perspectives that might be different from our own.
It's like don't just settle for the easy answer. Keep digging, keep learning.
Exactly. And I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to remembering that every life matters. Every story matters. Whether it's making headlines or not, every human experience adds to the bigger picture.
I like that. It's like a reminder that even when we're dealing with these really dark, heavy topics, we're all connected in some way.
That's a great way to put it. We all have value, regardless of our circumstances or choices, or even how the media portrays us.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive, wouldn't you say? Two women, both named Susan Smith, both caught up in these terrible tragedies, but in such different ways. It really makes you think about how complicated truth can be, and how much we still don't understand about human nature.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's a good reminder to approach these stories with an open mind and open heart, to look for the humanity in every situation, even when it's really, really hard to see.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this pretty intense journey. It definitely got heavy at times, but I hope we were able to shed some light on some important issues along the way.
I hope so too. And as always, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions. There's always more to discover, more to understand.
Until next time, keep diving deep.